to look around the room. Just look around the room. In the Jewish community, at the end of gatherings, people always say, next year in Jerusalem. I would like to make it a model of the psychedelic community next year. More people of color in the room. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, about how we're going to make sure that next year there'll be more people of color. Okay? So, the invitation to awaken trauma and suffering exists for all of us, whether facilitated by psychedelics or not. But we're here because we know that psychedelics work profoundly. My own awakening was stirred when I had decided to forgo the deadening numbing of SSRIs and pray to a God that I had learned about as a child in a church in Compton. See, since leaving Compton and arriving at Harvard when I was 17, I had been seeing therapists and doctors who had been pointing me to a monoamine theory of suffering and generously helping me to excavate my childhood for examples of trauma. There was no discussion of race, class, privilege, or power, or the fields of trauma that we live in every day in a society. Having grown up primarily with my father, a single dad who raised 5 children by himself, there were indeed stories of loss. Yes, I feel the finger claps on that. Thank you. There were indeed stories of loss. The need to move in the middle of the night because we couldn't make rent, and the chaos and distraction of people who are living in poverty and living in survival mode. And for years, I went back and retold these stories of loss. The tape replayed itself, growing gnarled, thin, and tangled, but the tape played on. And well-meaning therapists helped me co-author these stories, and that was the only way I came to see my past. But on a leave of absence from work, sobbing and praying on the couch, I asked God to show me what had me so stuck. And instead of a story of pain, God showed me my Father's immense love for me. So what was this other story that was always available to me, one of love, that was available to me through a direct experience of my own consciousness? Over time, memories of joy returned to me, and those over-rented by a focus on trauma, those happy memories resurfaced to my mind. Memories of my father at PTA meetings, of his joy as he watched his children play, and of his immense pride in me, his baby girl. I did further work with medically provided ketamine, and I woke from one reality into a completely different one full of abundant love, a narrative that traditional therapy simply didn't have the collateral information to allow me to see. Maybe because the simplicity of an abundance of love in my family wasn't apparent from the middle-class lens. It was the abundance of my father, who worked in construction, helping me to solder together a 3D model of a metal DNA helix, while my peers brought in flaccid construction paper replicas. It was my uncle, the gift that he gave to me before I went off to Harvard. He hadn't even completely recovered from his addiction to drugs, but he gave me his Narcotics Anonymous book. It was the most important thing to him in his life. He gave it to me because he wanted me to have it, so I would have wisdom and strength for the road ahead. That's the love I received. But instead of a focus of poverty, there was always emotional and spiritual wealth that traditional therapy did not help me perceive. I could not drink from the water of the dominant well and be nourished because what I needed was a radical elevation in my consciousness that saw me not as a subject of pity, but as the embodiment of possibility and power. What I learned through my personal experience was that for some, it's not through excavating stories of pain that we're going to be transformed, but instead, it's our present and direct connection to joy and love that will transform us. Instead of being in the hypnosis of stories about race, class, or gender that separate us from our self-knowledge, the chemical reactions that exploded in my mind shut down my default mode network and reunited me to my true self. Now I wake and live knowing that peace is mine. Safety and security are mine, as are joy and immense love. The overall lesson that I learned from these experiences is that we disadvantage communities of color, women, queer communities, and those with different abilities when we can only see them through the lens of lack. Through the lack that has been historically and systematically created. We have to situate suffering, anxiety, depression into the realities of race, gender, class, heterosexism, and even sizeism. Our society structurally creates poverty that causes the chaos, distress, trauma that leads to separation from our knowledge of our worth and our loveliness. Everyone here is lovely. The profound, historically Eurocentric model of therapy, that the sick one is the individual, that it is the individual instead of the family, the community, or society itself that needs healing, this is a bias that needs correction and causes further separation. We hinder ourselves when we pathologize ourselves, numb ourselves, and think that medicalization is the answer, when, as Johann Hari argues, it is our lost connections that is the disease. Community, cultural healing, group action, and policy change is likely a more healthy solution. I'm excited to be here today and talk to you about the unique opportunities of healing that Psychedelic offers to minority and marginalized communities. One of the important things that psychedelics offer marginalized communities is that it offers a positivistic and resourcing frame of healing. One learns that a direct experience of worth and wholeness is much more powerful than a story about what has happened to you. The magic and miracle of these medicines is that the experience of wholeness, safety, peace can transcend even the bleakest of material circumstances. Second, by providing a client with a direct experience of their own consciousness, guided by their own inner intelligence, psychedelic therapy may bypass some of the challenges of cross-cultural, cross-gender therapy by minimizing the symbology and meaning-making system of the therapists themselves. There is power in being able to invite and receive wisdom directly from your own ancestors. Finally, the empowerment that can come from feeling whole, maybe for the first time in your life, can shift vulnerable populations into the role of author and authority on their health and wellness, allowing them to write their own narratives of strength and power. Patients come to reject the victim position that vulnerable populations are frequently cast into. We can grow to tell empowered stories and grow out of the stories that say that lack is our only inheritance. Released from anxiety, free from depression, anger, and distraction, we can then create from our joy. Having disassociated from the painful stories of the past handed to us, we write new stories of our empowerment in our own voice from the highest sight of our own vision. This is our path forward. This is how we create new realities in a new world. As a college student at Harvard, I started off as a sociology major, full of statistics and knowledge about the past. But it is with deliberate purpose that I'm not quoting statistics to you today. I know about the state of health disparities, educational disparities right now. But I know this history, but I want to engage you in a new conversation about possibility. My health and leverage was found in moments of liberated freedom, joy, and pleasure, not in a solid belief in subjugation or impoverishment. I talk about possibility because I believe, as Gandhi did, that a small body of determined spirits fired by unquenchable faith in their mission can alter the course of history. I think the psychedelic is a small body. Psychedelic community is a small body. I think you guys are determined spirits. So I think we can change the course of history. We, in the psychedelic community, are poised to change the society and the diversity in this room next year by increasing access to wellness and creating inclusion for all people. I am a pragmatic visionary, however, and I know that the experience of love alone is not a strategic response to social violence. Love, however, is the first self-treatment for the person who has experienced separation from their true self. It's how we stay soft, human, and able to be in connection. It's how we grow larger to hold the pain of what we have experienced and not live dissociated from our hearts. Love doesn't address the external disruption. However, it heals the internal wound of the heart, mending us and strengthening us by our choice to love. Love can support us as we find the strength and courage to manifest into the world what our hearts first knew. Through psychedelic-assisted therapy, we can uplift the hearts and manifest the minds of all people so that we can all rise together. I've been thinking a lot about Harriet Tubman, a fiercely strong woman who led many to freedom in the North on the Underground Railroad. As a teen, she suffered a violent head trauma that resulted in her spiritual awakening. Historians say that she started having visions and speaking to God on a daily basis. This spiritual knowledge made her fearless in a world that would attempt to dominate her spirit and her body. It gave her a parallel vision of the world that empowered her to seek her own vision and her own freedom. On making it to freedom in Pennsylvania, she remarked, "I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. And my home, after all, was down in Maryland because my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and my friends were there." Inspired by her immense love for her family, she went back to the South, undergoing 13 additional 100-mile journeys by foot, risking recapture into the brutality of slavery to help many, many more find their freedom. Her story reminds me that every liberation, every revolution, and every movement starts with a liberated mind. It is ushered forward by those who have undergone a change in consciousness. As we increase access to spiritual liberation for all people, increasing the training of diverse therapists who sit with all people, we can also create an anti-racist anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic, and womanist psychedelic culture for all people to integrate into their being. As we heal and experience the liberation, we are called also to journey for others and for the new world that we can create. May we answer the call to journey for the physical safety of Black men and for the healthy birth outcomes for Black women. After a history of redlining and discrimination in lending, may we answer the call to sit and hold space for a vision of economic prosperity and home ownership for the Black community. May we be in ceremony for diversity in healthcare providers so that all patients can receive medical care in their native tongue. We are called to create rituals that uproot the biases within our systems of criminal justice, law enforcement, healthcare, education, and beyond. May we continue to sit for federal approval of MDMA-assisted therapy so that female victims of violence can experience liberation. Having experienced their own freedom, it is my hope that they will come back and journey for the hearts of men affected by toxic masculinity so that they too can know self-responsibility and spiritual liberation. Harriet Tubman teaches me that the cards are stacked as they are, but if you are the right kind of crazy, transformed, indomitable, and full of faith, we can all find our way to freedom. And then we can be courageous and travel back to help others to journey out of suffering. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do a call and response. We'll practice it. First with the example of next year in Jerusalem. Next year? No, where we're going to be? Okay, now, people of color. Next year? More people of color in this room. Questions. Questions and answers. Yes, here.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name's Hannah.
Love your hair.
Thank you. I was wondering what you think how society and in particular medical professionals can gain the trust of Black families. I know that there's a very huge distrust between the Black communities and medical professionals, from the syphilis trials to just about any interaction that you have, especially since a lot of our primary caregivers are white men. So I was wondering, how do you think we can bridge that barrier?
I'm gonna quote a white man to answer this question. And Bill Clinton was asked this question by a politician or a congressman, and someone turned to Bill Clinton and said, "You know what? Black constituents, they like you. They seem to get along with you. How do you do that?" And Bill Clinton replied, basically, it's like, "I really genuinely like them." And so it's from the love and compassion that you can genuinely express, getting over your fear and your story. And that always communicates. And yes, there is history and there is suspicion,
But that's why increasing diversity and representation of healthcare providers is so important. It's really, really important. I know there are a lot of people in alliance and allegiance as allies for improving health outcomes for communities of color. And we both have to meet in the middle, increasing our compassion and also increasing the presence of people of color who can serve our communities. Yes.
How can we incorporate voices of people of color, especially from indigenous cultures who have been working with these plant medicines for thousands of years? How do you think we can do that? Let me rephrase that. What would your thoughts be on incorporating their views and their values and their practices in a way that avoids this very negative thing that we call cultural appropriation? How do we do it appropriately? How do we appropriate it appropriately, if that's possible? I don't want to use the word, but what are your thoughts? Thank you.
So at Esalen, the Psychedelic Integration Conference last year, this was brought up and we made some recommendations. So basically, if we want to include all voices, we have to create a policy that goes before us when we're planning and convening, that we've already thought about and considered, that our value statement, our mission statement is that we are a community of all people. So when you start planning a conference, your values go before you when you're creating that conference, and you start making sure that you invite all people from all tribes to be in participation. That's a very important part. Psychedelics is about connection, right? It's all about being in relationship. So we have to be in relationship with all communities. And there's a level of humility that we have to approach this with, meaning that we really have to honor the legacy of what's been given to us by other spiritual traditions. Mine being the African American church tradition, that's where I started. But just really that word appropriation makes me so nervous. But to come in humility, because really it's from our Western civilized world's brokenness of what we've perpetuated that people are going to Peru and Ecuador to get their healing on. So, yeah. I want to make a comment. Or are there other questions? Yes.
One of the first things you said coming up here was that you wanted to see more diversity in this room next year.
Or these spaces, yes.
Yeah. How do you want to make that happen? And what are the options that you know of that could make that happen next year in this room?
So my first response was to say, how do you want to make that happen?
I'll sponsor a few people. If there's structure for that, I'm willing to do that, or donate hours specific to a project. I personally wouldn't be able to, I don't have the bandwidth to lead a project like that, but I could certainly start that fire.
I love the idea of sponsoring spots, tickets, just to make sure that there's diversity in the room. Until we make it so that there's not the class inequality that we associate with race, sponsorship works.
From your perspective, what's holding people back? What's prohibiting the engagement for others to be here?
I think that we are at a moment, especially through the work that BIA does, where we're bringing more voices of color to the front, talking about the fact that healing is available for all people. And given the legacies of trauma that do exist in communities of color and do exist in all communities, we want to create an invitation for all people to come and drink from the well. That, in large part for me, will probably be more the result of decriminalization than it is of the traditional medical model, because healing happens in communities, and through decriminalization, civic organizations, churches can take responsibility of the healing of their communities. Next question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate all the sentiment. I want to figure out exactly how to word this, that I feel like we have a kind of two directions to tackle something as large as racism in this country. We definitely need to integrate in every community that we can. But sadly, I really don't like visiting my Uncle Tony because he's quite bigoted. Do you have any ideas on how to approach a person like that to convince him that it would be worth making the connections to people that he discriminates against?
He is not my target audience.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But you are, meaning that,
Or maybe that I could convince Uncle Tony.
yeah. What I'm saying is, when you get into the literature about, how do we create an anti-racist society, that's your work, right? That's your work. So that's your cousin, and it's your cousin's children, right? And so how do we mentor and foster in a new consciousness? One of the things when I was a part of the Oakland decriminalized nature movement, there was a comment made in the audience. One of the people said, Oakland has a lot of trauma. Oakland's, a community of color primarily, and San Francisco is not where I live. And someone said, Oakland has a lot of trauma. And I had to correct them and say, Oakland doesn't have a lot of trauma. San Francisco also has a lot of trauma, because what is it about a city that would not include and make possible diversity, that would allow its local native sons and daughters to move out because of gentrification and not make space for them? So when we're talking about trauma and healing, it's a bi-directional conversation, because there's stories that you hold about possibly me and I hold about you that we need to be in conversation about, so that I can give you freedom and liberation to be your best self, and you can give me the space to be my best self, right? My time is up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.